Episode 3 of 3 for patterning, multi-body techniques. This episode is less about the geometry itself and more about control over the geometry, whatever it is you decide to create. If you've ever wondered if multi-bodies might be helpful to your workflow, you are in luck, because you know somebody who's into multi-bodies, and it's me. Let's get into it. I'm Jesse, and here are some solid ideas. All right, so we've gone through the sort of diamond work mat so far with the ribs. We've gone through the hex work mat that we made with the fill pattern. If you missed those episodes, I'll put links to those. You can check those out. Now we're on to what we might do sort of at the end of that last video where our hex pattern went too far. We need to either cut it back or try to get control over it some other way. And this is that some other way that we can gain control over our geometry. So because these types of geometries that we're creating that are fairly complex in comparison to the geometry around it anyway, has to interact with all of the geometry around it, right? And we might want separate control over this than we do over the piece as a whole, and that's exactly what multi-bodies can do for us. Now, multi-bodies, if you're not familiar with those, you might think, well, that's basically just an assembly, right? I'm putting a bunch of blocks of material into one place and I have individual control over those, sort of. Multi-body is multiple chunks of material within one particular part file. Now you can think of this, the easiest way is probably a weldment. That's really what it was designed for initially, is you've got a bunch of little pieces that are all cut up separately. They're all welded together. When they get to the assembly, it is technically one part, but you need individual control over all of those little pieces that you're cutting up and welding together to make a frame or whatever the case is. Those techniques can be applied all over the place, and they are very, very helpful to know. Let's take a look at it in a case here where we have some complexity that we're adding into the model. I'm going to roll back, and we're not going to create the geometry this time just to speed things up a little bit, just since this is more about the control. So let's roll back to a point in time that is kind of the beginning of where this process would start. Let's actually go right back to the start of this all, and we can see what tweaks we need to make to be able to make this happen. So we'll roll back one at a time here, and we'll add in the first feature that I've created. Now this starts off just like it did with the fill pattern. Nothing different here other than I happen to start in a different location for this particular shape here, and I just patterned straight down. However, if you look carefully in the tree, there is one small difference. And if we look over to the top, we see that we have a solid bodies folder here. Now this is not always here by default. I have a tendency to turn mine on by default so I can see it all the time, just because I do a lot of multi-body work. But that's your decision as far as whether you want that on or off. It will become available as soon as you're in a situation when you would need it. So it's perfectly fine the way it is by default. We see that underneath this folder here, we've got two separate bodies. How did this happen? This looks like a normal part. How did we get to this point? Well, there's one little checkbox that I used inside of this feature. So let's edit this feature and we'll take a look here. When creating this feature, I made one slight adjustment that moved me into a multi-body situation, and that is this merge result checkbox. As soon as you uncheck that, that says, okay, don't combine this with the rest of the stuff that's there, which it normally would do by default, right? Every time we're adding features into our part, it's stacking them together, it's building on the clay that we're putting together, it's all one glob of clay at the end. If you uncheck this merge result checkbox, it will not do that and say, I will keep this separate as its own body, as its own thing. You can decide what to do with it down the road. So that's what I did here with this initial feature. I turned that off and I said, leave that as its own thing. We're going to worry about it later. So at this point, we've got two separate bodies to work with. I then patterned that body, and that is a slight adjustment as well. So let's take a look at this. This looks exactly the same as what we were doing before with the rib. We were linear patterning it. This looks exactly the same, and it is, with again one slight adjustment. So if we look in the pattern itself, we'll see that the pattern looks exactly the same. And in fact, it is in this case. And we've got these features and faces selected, and this will work because it is a feature. But what you would really want to do is select this over to bodies and select the body itself. So I would recommend making that adjustment when you're doing linear patterns of bodies rather than leaving it in features and faces like it was. So switch that over to bodies, and that will take the group of material that it is and move that along whatever the pattern parameters are. This is nice because whatever that is, maybe you've got some other features added in. It's not just one single feature. We don't have to select multiple features. This is saying take that group of material, move it somewhere else. All right, so we'll switch that over to bodies and say, okay, in this case, we'll get exactly the same result. It was only one feature, but that's an adjustment that you'd want to make when working with separate bodies. Now that was expanded and we did the same thing. I patterned that pattern along both directions and resulted in this kind of cool looking pattern. Now this resulted in the exact same problem that we ended up with when we did the last episode and doing that pattern that filled out the region that we selected. In that case, we had the pattern poking up through this section here. I specifically designed this to fit within these parameters, so that wasn't an issue, but the width then became an issue. So same problem, just a different location. So we see that here they are sticking out the side, and I've got to do something about this. Now, if these were all one continuous piece of material, I now have to go back and try to figure out how to shave these pieces back off or trim these back. And that's going to be a little bit tricky because they come poking out the corner. I might have to do some direct editing, delete faces, or try to figure out how to remove those in some clever way. Now, these are not all one piece, as we've just discussed. We've put this into a multi-body situation, so we have a little bit different options when we arrive at a case like this. Now, you'll see that the next feature in the feature tree is a combine. So the way that that works is we now have selective control over what gets grouped together. Now, if you've used features in multi-bodies before, you know that there is an option at the bottom that you may have seen for feature scope where you can control what actually gets grouped together with what. You can also do that manually with a combine feature. So that's a feature that will group things together, add, subtract, any kind of Boolean type operation. Now, what's great about that is that gives you full control. So in this case, you'll see that we have a solid bodies count of 139 bodies because each one of these little hexes is its own body. We patterned the bodies. And then we've got the mat itself. Now, you might think, okay, well, selecting this is going to be a nightmare, but that isn't really the case. So we can hide and show bodies at will. I'll use the tab key on my keyboard to hide the body that I'm hovering over. And now we have all of these bodies together. So we can use the combine feature, just box select all of those guys, merge them all together into one added feature. And you can see that's exactly what happens here. So if we look at the combine, once this combines these all together, now that I've rolled this down, we'll see that just the pattern geometry itself now becomes one body. All right, so we can take a look in the feature here, and we'll see the parameters for this, just combining all of these box selected in an add type format. So that leaves us now with two bodies, our complex shape, and then the other body itself, right? So if we shift and tab to bring that back, we now have two separate pieces. We can get this guy out of the way, right? They're just two separate pieces. And you'll see the two of those in here, which we have control over there as well. Now this gives us the ability to cut only a certain body. And this is what I was referring to when I was talking about feature scope. So if we take a look at this feature here, this cut extrude, this allows me to cut only regions that I want to be affected. So in this case, I selected the whole region for the pocket, and I did a flip side to cut and say, cut everything that's outside of that pocket, but hold on, only apply that to this body. So this feature scope here towards the bottom is exactly what I was referring to earlier. And rather than having this feature apply to the whole piece of geometry, I now have this only applying to the pattern itself. And I say, trim all of the bounds away. I only want this to fit in this pocket. Anything outside of that pocket needs to go, but only for this group of geometry that I've created. All right, so once we say okay to that, that trims out everything outside of that. And then we're free to combine things back together. Any filleting that needs to happen, well, all of those operations you can apply there. Use that combine feature again to put that back together. So that is kind of the idea. And again, less about the geometry itself. This technique applies to all sorts of different scenarios where you need control over individual groups of geometry. It just so happens it's a good technique to use in a case like this, where you might have some complex geometry that you're trying to insert into, in this case, fairly simple geometry, but you need individual control over each one of those types of geometry. Now, that kind of wraps up this section for these episodes of adding in, again, air quotes, complex geometry. As I mentioned, everything is kind of relative. I will admit that the complexity of this is taken down a notch from what you might run into when working on patterns. And that is for one particular reason. These were all flat, right? All of our patterns were on this flat bottom face, which really saves quite a bit of frustration in trying to get this geometry laid in there. We can just project it flat and not worry about it. If you're working on a much more complex surface, that is going to take the complexity, no pun intended, up a little bit as well, right? If you've got some fluid surface that you're trying to build these patterns onto, then you might be into using the wrap tool or some surfacing command to try to get that in. Or if you're getting to a point where you've got a very complex pattern on a complex surface, that's when you would be getting into the realm of procedural modeling, right? You might be using a tool like Pattern Creator to create and build these with equations rather than trying to build geometry. Now, that's not exactly what this episode is about, but if you're interested in that, you can check out some cool stuff that Noah Zeef has done. I'm sure at some point in this channel, we'll be taking a look at some of that because I love anything procedural, super cool. So maybe at some point we'll see some of that, but just an admission there that the complexity of patterns can get pretty crazy. So it's a cool way to move into working with geometry in a whole different way when you're working with procedural modeling. Cool stuff. All right, well, if you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe. We'll see you in the next episode where we talk about how to deal with all of this geometry once we get it in there. We've made quite a mess of faces. How do we select this and get our fillets in and all of that kind of thing that we would need if we're going to actually be molding this type of geometry? So I'll see you in the next one.